Tonight, I'm going to make some comparisons between Joe Biden and FDR. This is the wheelchair FDR had when he died. I bought this not because I'm a big fan of FDR, because FDR, he didn't believe in the individual. And it's ironic because I think the greatest thing about FDR was he forced himself to walk even though he had no power from his legs at all. But most people wouldn't know that. His wheelchair was hidden from the public all the time. And yet it was the guy on the other side of the water that said people who are handicapped, they're not real people. They don't have a quality of life. And so Hitler was killing them. Hitler was defeated in part by a guy in a wheelchair. That's one of the greatest stories I've ever heard. Somebody who thought he had no chance made his own way. That's where my love affair with FDR ends, because FDR, despite the fact that he did the impossible, he didn't think you could do the impossible. He didn't believe in the individual, thus the large state that he gave us. What FDR gave us was really the groundwork that has allowed so many in the previous administrations to create what we're living today. And if you think FDR was bad, wait until you see what is coming. Because Joe Biden is not the next FDR. Joe Biden is in a category all by himself.
In his last hours, President Roosevelt was at work on a speech to be delivered the next day. In it, he was to say, quote, "Today, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all people, of all kinds, to live together and work together in the same world at peace."
That quote is far from the only aspect President Biden borrowed from FDR. Both men led America with their head in the clouds, with wishful thinking that did, and that is now, taking America into a very different and dangerous place. Joe Biden has purposefully positioned himself to become a modern-day FDR, and if he succeeds, our nation may never be the same again. To understand Biden, you first have to really understand FDR. So tonight, I take you back in time to the Roosevelt era, showing you the similarities between both commanders-in-chief and for the destruction their policy agendas could bring to America today. Tonight, Fascist Fantasies, the dangerous origins of Biden's takeover. Hello, America. From the Standing Rock Ranch, one of my barns on our ranch in Idaho. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. I want to talk to you about something I never understood even with my grandparents. FDR is like everybody's favorite. Worship him endlessly if you've ever called yourself a Democrat. Why? Well, it's because FDR lived the ultimate progressive dream, and he was elected president 4 times. What is the line in The Music Man? The man's a gall-darn spellbinder. He was. He remade America. He remade the executive branch with a buffet of offices and the new powers. What would you like? Maybe a little of this and that. And he got to reach into every aspect of American life with 87 government programs that were part of his New Deal. Democrats still are like, oh, New Deal, oh, it's magic, isn't it? I'm telling you, FDR spent more money than any other president in U.S. history. On FDR's watch, the national debt increased 1,048%. One historian who wrote a book about FDR's infamous first 100 days said President Biden is on track now to spend at least 10 times that much after adjusting for inflation. All right, so there's a reason why Joe Biden and FDR have this in common, and it's because Biden is a live-action plaything. He's role-playing FDR. Don't be surprised if all of a sudden, you see him with one of those fedoras and that. I mean, it's coming. Biden's FDR fantasy started as soon as he cleared Bernie Sanders out of the way during the 2020 presidential election. I don't know if it started with him or the handlers or whoever's really calling the shots on all this stuff, convincing him you're going to be the next FDR. Biden and his advisors began closely studying FDR's presidency as a model to follow. Biden even reportedly read books about FDR's first 100 days. And it didn't take long for the Democrats and the media to get on board with this Biden as FDR narrative. Think about what they are covering for Joe Biden and his son. Is it any bigger than the president's actually in a wheelchair and can't walk? That most Americans didn't know because the press just didn't report it? Even the guy Biden has just knocked out of the race jumped on the bandwagon. Do you remember this?
The compromise that they came up with, if implemented, will make Biden the most progressive president since FDR.
Okay. Throughout the rest of the campaign, Biden marketed himself as the next FDR. In an interview with The New Yorker, he said, quote, "I'm kind of in a position that FDR was. What, in fact, FDR did was not ideological. It was just completely practical." Well, Biden's presidency has already proved the exact opposite. What he does is completely ideological and totally impractical. You're feeling that every time you go to the gas station or the grocery store. Just 1 week before the 2020 election, Biden left his basement to give a rare campaign speech in Warm Springs, Georgia. Now, that seems random until you realize that was the location of the polio treatment facility where FDR used to stay for extended periods. That wheelchair that I showed you, that was the wheelchair he died in there at Warm Springs. He had a house there and a girlfriend, but the press never reported that either. Biden hoped for the FDR vibes and hoped that they would rub off on him and hypnotize America. Watch.
In the years that followed, FDR would come back to Warm Springs often to think about how to heal the nation and the world. And that's exactly what he did. Lifting us out of a Great Depression, defeating tyranny, saving democracy. Warm Springs is a reminder that though broken, each of us can be healed. That as a people and a country, we can overcome this devastating virus, that we can heal a suffering world, and yes, we can restore our soul and save our country.
Wow. Biden was not elected to be either savior or a transformational president. He was elected, and correct me if I'm wrong, to be boring. But progressives think getting elected to any office is a green light to transform everything. And President Biden's guiding force could not be more clear. There's a massive portrait of FDR that faces the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. George Washington is the one that usually occupies that space above the fireplace. But this is really one of the new founders. Biden demoted him in favor of this new founder, FDR. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. On Biden's very first day as president, he sent a letter to his incoming science advisor seeking recommendations on the way the federal government can harness the full power of science and technology on behalf of the American people. He seemed to be sending the letter mostly because FDR did exactly the same thing with his science advisor in 1944. I mean, you can't make this up. In fact, Scientific American reported that, quote, "the parallels between FDR and Biden's letters are striking." If only the parallels stopped at letter writing, but they don't. During Biden's first address to the nation after taking office, he tried his best to do his best FDR fireside chat imitation. Watch.
I need you, the American people. I need you. I need every American to do their part. If we do our part, if we do this together, by July the 4th, there's a good chance you, your families and friends will be able to get together in your backyard or in your neighborhood and have a cookout and a barbecue and celebrate Independence Day.
This was an echo of FDR's heavy-handed National Recovery Administration, which requested that all small business owners hang the Blue Eagle sign in their shop window to show they were on board. They're doing their part with FDR's price and labor codes. Below the eagle on the sign, it says, "We do our part." But just after a month after Biden took office, he hosted some kind of FDR pep rally for himself at the White House. And he invited big-name presidential historians, including Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meacham, and invited them to a private meeting, which the White House kept under wraps. For 2 hours, the historians took turns fanning the flames of Biden's FDR love while he took notes. Axios reported that they talked quite a lot about, quote, the elasticity of presidential power and the limits of going bigger and faster than the public might anticipate or stomach. Any of this sound familiar? According to Axios, the historians' views were so much in sync with Biden's own. It's better to go even bigger and faster than anyone expected. If that means even chucking the filibuster and the bipartisanship, well, then so be it. It's weird to invite historians to the White House after you've just taken the job to help you figure out how to manufacture a giant legacy. It's like a baseball player planning for the Hall of Fame before he's even stepped to the plate. It's even weirder when a group of descendants of FDR and his original cabinet are also lobbying Biden to emulate FDR as much as possible. Ever get the feeling we're in a play? The group calls itself the Descendants. Oh, that's not a creepy name. They meet weekly to plot strategy. They write op-eds and press releases urging Biden to be an activist president and get rid of the filibuster. They've even met with Biden's Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. The Descendants say they want Biden to get, and I quote, as close to a replica of FDR as possible. Does this frighten anyone? Does everyone think this is normal except me? Naturally, once mainstream media got wind of Biden wanting to channel FDR, they were all in to help sell the fantasy. Here's a prime example of the media's gushing from CNN's David Gergen. Quote, from a deadly pandemic to a stalled economy to a threatening climate and explosive racial tensions, Biden inherited the worst set of crises since Roosevelt and has had only the thinnest of Democratic margins in Congress. Yet, he quickly took charge. Really? The worst set of crisis since Roosevelt? Cuban Missile Crisis? When Biden got his American Rescue Plan passed almost right out of the gate, the left lost their mind. This was truly FDR-style action, a $1.9 trillion relief package that was bigger than anything that had been passed in the last 50 years. It included another $122 billion for K through 12 schools, even though many school districts hadn't even spent their COVID relief payments from 2020. The $122 billion is the largest ever one-time payment of federal money toward education. Oh, and 93% of this new money Biden sent to them still has not been spent as of last month. What's that for? Biden's American Rescue Plan also gave $1,400 checks to every person in a family, expanded unemployment insurance and tax credits for the children, and gave $350 billion more to states for, general COVID stuff. 1 year later, even some in the left-wing media are now starting to admit that, the fire hydrant that he opened up of spending, might have something to do with the inflation crisis. The American Rescue Plan was obviously Biden's cannon blast attempt at renewing the New Deal, which one historian described last year as, quote, a new definition of what the government owes us when we're in trouble. Do you hear that logic of the left? The pandemic caused such hardship that only a massive amount of government cash can possibly save us. But there is a huge difference between the circumstances of the Great Depression and the government-inflicted COVID lockdowns that have caused so much economic havoc. FDR rationalized the New Deal by saying, and I quote, better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. Joe Biden cannot explain his New Deal quite like FDR, but you know the thing. Biden is clearly going for the kind of bombastic federal programs that will make him legendary. He's going for it in spite of 90 years of evidence that this brand of government overreach doesn't work. In fact, it causes more problems. Have you seen outside lately? After a quick break, I want to take you through Biden's overreach plans, all inspired by FDR. To a certain extent, you are in charge of your future and the future of your family. You can't anticipate or stop everything, of course, but you can do a lot. For instance, how are your financing looking these days? Are you cutting spending where you can, putting money back every chance that you can get, buying maybe extra food or whatever it is, saving for retirement or college funds or for the kids and things like that? Let me offer you a piece of advice. Now more than ever, you should place a call to American Financing. They are a family-owned company. They have been run with that family spirit for 2 decades, and they've been helping people just like you get their finances in better shape. In 10 minutes, you can get a free mortgage review that could lead to you saving hundreds of dollars a month, maybe even $1,000. If you get a consolidation loan or a mortgage refi, you could end up saving hundreds of dollars every month. Why? Because you're not paying 20% interest on those credit cards. You'll be paying 4 or 5. You can close in as little as 10 days, and you can skip up to 2 mortgage payments. So call them. American Financing at 800-906-2440, 800-906-2440. It's AmericanFinancing.net.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
From the moment Joe Biden took office, there has been a major problem with his go big and fast strategy compared to his hero, FDR. FDR had large majorities in the House and the Senate. When FDR was first elected in 1932, the Democrats gained 97 seats in the House, which gave them a majority, a 313 to 117 majority. And the Democrats owned the Senate as well, 59 to 37. 4 years later, FDR became so popular, he enjoyed even bigger majorities. Republicans at that time only had 89 representatives and 17 senators. So whatever this guy wanted, he could get. Now that's slightly different reality than the majority Biden has to work with. He only has the tie-breaking Kamala Harris vote in the Senate and only a 9-seat majority in the House. FDR was also elected in a landslide, beating Herbert Hoover by 17 points and winning 42 states. And the thing on Herbert Hoover was he didn't do anything. So FDR was hired to do something and to do something big. Biden won in 2020 by just 4.5 points. 4 states were decided by 1.5 points or less. This reality doesn't exactly scream mandate for change for Joe Biden. But if there's anything we know about Biden and this administration and all those on the left, they can't read a room or they don't care. So despite having zero mandate for major action, and despite his terrible job approval rating, Biden is still bulldozing ahead like he is FDR. Last October, even as Democrats were trimming the Build Back Better proposal, Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, was bragging about the scope of their plan. Quote, "It is twice as big in real dollars as the New Deal was. This can be the Congress that goes from 12 years of universal education to 14 years. That makes the largest investment in fighting climate change ever. That cuts what families pay for childcare in half." FDR's New Deal used infrastructure projects to employ millions of Americans. They built the Hoover Dam. They built 39,000 new schools, 2,500 hospitals, 325 airports just in the 1930s. So, of course, Biden wants to get in with that kind of legacy on his own infrastructure deal. To get something passed in the Senate, he had to carve off the infrastructure part of his larger, bigger Build Back Better proposal. But the $1 trillion infrastructure bill passed in November with 13 Republicans supporting it in the House and 19 in the Senate. The bill includes goodies like $66 billion for train travel. Well, that's great if you are commuting between Washington, D.C. and New York on Amtrak. Most of that money is going to Amtrak, which is the very definition of money well spent. And then $7.5 billion to build a network of electric vehicle charging stations, and another $21 billion towards economic and environmental social justice. $65 billion for broadband internet access in rural parts of America. By the way, I don't need that. It's extraordinarily affordable here in a place that has no internet, no electricity. I've got Elon Musk, and I'm using his, what is it called? Starlink. That's how I'm brought to you tonight. Starlink. Hello. Why do we need the government? What? Now, the broadband internet thing, that one, he was trying to echo FDR with his 1936 Rural Electrification Act, which brought electricity to rural Americans. Kind of different. Also, just like FDR, President Biden is a diehard union guy. A month into Biden's presidency, and the House passed the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is all about increasing the number of workers who must pay union dues. You know, those good union jobs. It would nullify the right to work laws in many states that currently allow workers who don't pay union dues to keep their job. After the House passed the PRO Act, President Biden also signed an executive order creating the White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment. It plans to take a whole of government approach to empower workers. Oh. So the joke here is that workers' right to organize isn't in any danger. It doesn't need any protecting or empowering. No one's stopping workers from joining unions. Why are you stopping people who don't want to be in a union? This is an overreach, which directly related to FDR's overreach in 1935 with the National Labor Relations Act, which is basically a gift to labor unions for helping put FDR in the White House. Biden's executive order creating the task force actually says, quote, "Since 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act was enacted, the policy of federal government has been to encourage worker organizing and collective bargaining, not to merely allow or to tolerate them. In the 86 years since the act was passed, the federal government has never fully implemented this policy." Essentially, Biden is finishing FDR's great work, and that is also a theme. The task force has set 4 goals. One of them is to, quote, "increase union membership all across the United States." So basically, a government task force on creating more lifelong voters for the Democratic Party. I don't remember that being part of the president's official duties to drive union membership. Is that somewhere in the Constitution? By the way, Biden's task force on worker organizing is is headed by Kamala Harris and the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. You know him, the guy who met with the Descendants group that I told you earlier? Yeah, that's quite a team. Another Biden initiative is growing eerily similar to one of FDR's. It involves the situation in Ukraine. In 1940, FDR addressed Americans on the radio, informing them that there was a growing threat from the Axis powers and that the U.S. would have to be, quote, the great arsenal of democracy in arming Great Britain and other European countries against Nazi aggression. Well, who'da thunk it? Less than 3 months later, the Lend-Lease Act was passed, allowing FDR to provide military equipment to Britain and any other country he thought vital to U.S. national security. Now, fast forward 80 years. Here's President Biden committing to the U.S. As the, quote, arsenal of democracy for Ukraine against Russia. Just a few weeks ago, the Senate passed a $40 billion military and humanitarian aid package for Ukraine. That brings America's total spend on the Ukraine war to $54 billion so far. They'll be back later this summer. In some alternate dimension, I think, where President Biden lives, you can apparently just spend nearly $2 trillion on COVID relief, another $1 trillion on infrastructure, $54 billion on Ukraine's war, and then hope that inflation goes away at the same time. Oh, by the way, you also want to bail out strategically those loans that might help you get students to vote for you. President Biden has many more FDR plans in the works, including the rest of Build Back Better, his fever dream. The House passed the $2 trillion Build Back Better bill in November, with zero, thank God, Republicans voting for it. It's all about social infrastructure, including universal pre-K and expanded health care. But most of all, it's about battling climate change. This is the Green New Deal we've been telling you about for years. They just gave it up for a far worse name. Fortunately, the bill is currently hung up in the Senate. One of Biden's most blatant efforts to plagiarize FDR is his Climate Conservation Corps, which is also part of the Build Back Better bill. This interesting proposal copies FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed over 3 million men between 1933 and 1942 to work on America's forests and parks. May I remind you, at the time, we had a 25% unemployment rate. So the government was just creating jobs. Hey, why don't you go pick up those candy wrappers over there? We currently have a shortage of workers, but Biden's CCC would employ 300,000 young people to battle climate change by restoring public lands and waters and work on reforestation. And my favorite line in this, quote, bolster community resilience. Oh, so is that like hosting a neighborhood pep rally? Is that what that is? One of FDR's favorite powers was playing with price controls. He didn't get us out of the Depression. He elongated the Depression. Here in America, it's called the Great Depression. Everywhere else in the world, it's known just as the Depression. It lasted forever here because of things like the National Recovery Administration. He created it in 1933 by executive order, which set prices and mandated codes of fair practices. The Supreme Court eventually declared it unconstitutional. But after the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, FDR again tried with the Office of Price Administration, followed by the Emergency Price Control Act. FDR argued that price controls and rationing were, quote, the only democratic, equitable solution. Oh, so wait a minute. Price controls and rationing. Now, there's nothing like food or gas that would put us in that situation very soon, would there? Is there? Now that inflation and gas prices are running wild, have you noticed? Oh, it is. It's a growing drumbeat on the left for good old-fashioned FDR price controls. And just last month, House Democrats passed the Consumer Fuel Price Gouging Prevention Act, which would give President Biden the authority to make emergency declarations banning energy prices issued in an excessive or exploitative manner. Wow, you know who else did this? Hugo Chavez. This is how dumb we've become. Congress, which has sole constitutional authority to make laws, is essentially giving the president lawmaking power. This bill also gives the Federal Trade Commission more power to investigate price gouging in the fuel industry. FDR would be so proud. When I come back, in 60 seconds, the key to understanding President Biden's strategy. If you own a home or property, here are a couple of reasons you never want to become the victim of home title fraud. Number one, when a cyber criminal worms his way into your home's title, he'll take out a loan and loan after loan after loan using everything that you have in your house, your equity. Then he'll take the cash and he'll vanish. You'll never see him again, leaving you to prove that you didn't commit fraud. And number two, you could be a victim of home title fraud and not even know it for months. No agency notifies you. Nobody asks if you sold your home or added someone to the title. You'll find out when the collection calls start or when the sheriff is on your front porch. Nobody knows how to stop this crime better than Home Title Lock, America's trusted leader for home title theft. So here's what I want you to do. Number one, go to HometitleLock.com, read the testimonials from retired FBI agents and government officials. Look it up. See if you think that this is something that, with all of our luck, will happen to us. Then register your home address to see if you aren't already a victim. And when you register to protect your home, there'll be a little space there to tell them that Glenn sent you. That way you can get 30 days free protection. So it's HometitleLock.com. That's HometitleLock.com.
But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure.
Wow. So a big part of what FDR meant by a temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure was the executive orders. And those executive orders skirt Congress and the Constitution. To progressives, the Constitution is a problem that they have to find a way around. Same with voting and Congress. They can't get all the things done that they think need to be done. And time of a crisis is the best time to solve that problem. I want you to remember what we talked about on last week's episode. We talked to you about the coming national emergency. Keep that in mind. FDR issued 3,721 executive orders over the course of his presidency, an average of 307 per year. Now, through executive orders, FDR essentially initiated laws, and then later the Democratic majority in Congress would follow up with an actual law to carry out what FDR's order had already stated. FDR used executive orders to create countless new offices and commissions that overhauled the executive branch and centralized power around that one man. This side of Roosevelt's strategy is near and dear to Joe Biden's heart because he has already issued 90 executive orders in just his first 16 months in office, by far more than any other president since Jimmy Carter. Just last week, Biden created a new Office for Environmental Justice. I don't even know what that means. FDR proved that once these offices are created, they never go away. They just add to the government bloat and red tape. If Democrats lose their majority in Congress this November, you can expect a lot more executive orders from President Biden for the rest of his term because it'll be the only tool at his disposal, and Congress must take those lawmaking rights back. He's already being pressured to use all of his executive orders since Democrats were unable to get all of his Build Back Better plan passed last year. The Congressional Progressive Caucus sent Biden a list of their demands, things they want him to accomplish quickly through executive orders, bypassing the Constitution. They call it their Agenda for Executive Actions, and they insist that, quote, this is not about abandoning the legislative path. It's about realizing the promise of democratic governance and quickly using all of the tools available just to make it happen. You can call that whatever you want. You can call that democratic, but it is not constitutional. The key to understanding Joe Biden's strategy as president really are the 3 R's from FDR's New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Now, pretty much every president gets legislative freebie when they first take office. So Biden took his freebie. He got his $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan with those $1,400 direct payments to most Americans. That was the relief part. The irony is that the worsening inflation under Biden is costing Americans between $350 to $500 extra per month, depending on where you live in the U.S. So let's just say you're in the middle of that range. Bidenflation is causing you $425 extra per month in added household costs. Over 12 months, that's $5,100, which is that more or less than the $1,400 relief check for a family of 4? So much for relief. Relief under President Biden has been costly enough, but the recovery and reform aspects are more dangerous and scary. For Democrats, recovery is now a perpetual project requiring a never-ending string of executive actions and spending to help the oppressed recover from whatever it is that's oppressing them today. One of President Biden's first executive orders was titled Ensuring an Equitable Pandemic Response and Recovery. 18% of Biden's 90 executive orders so far involve recovery from injustices related to some aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, recovery also includes the rest of social infrastructure, the parts of Build Back Better that are currently tied up in the Senate. Now, on the reform front, one of the most blatant ways Biden has copied FDR is with his executive order establishing a presidential commission to study court packing. FDR famously tried to pack the Supreme Court in 1937 after several unfavorable rulings on key parts of the New Deal. His plan called for adding up to 6 more justices. Remarkably, it was actually congressional Democrats who stood up to FDR and blocked this court packing scheme. The Senate Judiciary Committee report at the time called FDR's plan, quote, a needless, futile, and utterly dangerous abandonment of constitutional principles. I've had a long conversation on our podcast with Mike Lee a couple of weeks ago. He said once this happens, America is officially done. That is the last key that needs to be turned before you turn into a Venezuela. The committee recommended that the plan, quote, be so emphatically rejected that its parallel will never again be presented to free representatives of the free people of America. Well, that didn't happen because here we are again. FDR failed in his bid to pack the Supreme Court, but here's the part that often gets missed. It was brilliant intimidation that ended up working in his favor. When the Supreme Court began its first session after FDR had unveiled his court packing plan, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes started voting with the left-wing side of the court to approve every one of FDR's New Deal policies that came before the court, including the National Labor Relations Act. Before FDR tried to pack the court, the Labor Relations Act likely would have been struck down as unconstitutional. Does John Roberts sound familiar at all? FDR did not get to add justices to the court, but ultimately he didn't need to. In classic progressive fashion, he bullied the court into giving him the results he wanted. President Biden's commission to study court packing was similar in the warning shot to the Supreme Court justices. Well, especially John Roberts. Our Chief Justice has already been very chummy with the left wing of the court on decisions. He has been very protective of the Supreme Court as an institution, so it is reasonable to assume that he probably doesn't want to see more justices added to the court. Will that affect his decisions going forward? I don't know. Explain the decision on Obamacare, where he actually wrote the legislation. If nothing else, Biden now has the commission's study to use as a justification if he makes any court-packing attempts in the future. Fortunately, that's not very likely as long as the filibuster rule remains intact. But there is a very thin resistance keeping the filibuster alive, mainly Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Joe Biden's drive to leave an FDR-sized mark on the presidency has already been terrible for all American families. The economic consequences of Biden's policies are especially damaging, and his term isn't even halfway over. On the plus side, the midterm election is 5 months away, and that will be the best chance for voters to contain the fallout from Biden's retro New Deal. Up next, I want you to hear an FDR quote that I can guarantee you never learned in school. You know, it's just a few years ago that I was up here at the ranch, and I told my family, I don't think I can come back here anymore. And I love this place. It's up in the mountains, and I couldn't do it because my pain is made much worse with elevation. So every time I would go down to the valley and then come back up to the mountain, I was in so much pain. I don't have that problem anymore. Why? Relief factor. I know you might think it's not going to work for you because your pain or your body is different. I know that's exactly how I felt. I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm asking you to put $19.95, on your credit card or send them a check or however, and start taking it for 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, if it doesn't work, didn't work for you. But 70% of the people who try it go on to order more month after month. You want a drug-free, natural way to get your life back and do the things you want to do? ReliefFactor.com. That's ReliefFactor.com. If there is one FDR quote that people remember from school, it's probably the one from his first inaugural address in 1933. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So it's in our history books, at school because it's supposed to be inspirational. We don't have to be afraid of being afraid. And that is good. But according to FDR, this fear was not beatable because of the American spirit or the hard-earned individual freedom and autonomy secured in the Constitution. No. He thought it was beatable, this fear, because of what government could do for people. And by government, he mostly meant himself. The only thing we have to fear, that quote, sums up what most of our textbooks want us to know about FDR. He was a brave savior during the Great Depression, but he said a lot more in that same speech that doesn't make it into our textbooks. Like this near the end.
In the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
This is amazing because we are being set up for that speech. Progressives need a crisis to thrive. What he was saying there is, trust Uncle Franklin. I'm here. Just give me the keys and we'll pause the Constitution, but I'm going to fix everything. The founders never intended so much power to be concentrated in the executive branch, no matter what the crisis or the party. They knew what leaders tend to do with too much power. At the beginning of tonight, I said FDR did not believe in the individual. I don't think Joe Biden does either. His administration is already littered with crackdowns on individual liberty, from his vaccine mandates and eviction moratorium to his Justice Department treating parents like domestic terrorists, and the Disinformation Governance Board exploring ways to regulate your speech. This was Joe Biden last week on Memorial Day.
And remember, the Constitution, the Second Amendment, was never absolute.
Actually, I'm pretty sure the Constitution was intended to be absolute. You could amend it, yes, but that's a process. But other than doing that, it's absolute. The Constitution of the United States is the only thing standing between individual freedom and fascism. FDR even proposed at the end of his life a second Bill of Rights, and the left is still trying to push this through. It's not rights given to you from God. It's the rights you're granted by government. This is the reason why a president's oath of office is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution should be the most unifying factor in American politics. And the longer it is not, the further we slide towards fascism. More in a minute. A national emergency on climate change, I believe, is coming. It's only a matter of time, and I'm not sure how much time we have left, but it is coming. We are being set up for it, and they're telegraphing all of it. We're seeing it happen. Yesterday in the New York Times, they had a story on the Great Salt Lake drying up because of climate change, and they called it the Utah's climate change nuclear bomb. That sounds like an emergency. Food shortages already happening in Europe now. The head of USAID said, hopefully the shortages will convince farmers to go green. Treasury Secretary said there's nothing we can do about gas prices. This was yesterday, except invest in green energy, solar panels and windmills. And Biden declared he grabbed the war powers and took emergency action through the Defense Production Act on solar panels. It's crisis after crisis. And you just need to prepare for it so you don't have to have your hand out to the government. We have an amazing program on tomorrow's radio program, one you do not want to miss. And if you miss today's show, January 6th, a guy who's been solitary confinement for months spoke on our program. Get it at BlazeTV. Make sure you use the promo code BidenFlation and save. Good night.